what I want to do today is challenge our presumptions about megaliths, shaman and city builders, and explain what the connections are between cities and city builders and why they are hidden. And what I'm going to do is take you on a journey right back to the end of the Ice Age and give you an alternative interpretation of how living in cities came about, in particular by exploring these links between megaliths, shaman and city builders. And I'm going to present you with some surprising evidence from an unusual source that I think confirms these links. The first point to make is that we do not normally link megaliths, shaman with city builders. Indeed, there are no ancient cities associated with either Stonehenge or Avebury. If you mention megalith to anyone in Britain, these are normally the images that spring to mind, Stonehenge and Avebury. And if you say shaman, this is what people normally think of. I mean, some of the pictures in Peter Knight's interpretation. We think of primitive past, we think of nature, nature spirits, sacred groves of oak trees, landscape temples, zodiacs, rock springs, we think druids, Stonehenge, we think of John Michel, but we do not think of this, and nor do we think of this. And yet they are all linked. And one reason we do not make these connections is because of these people, the Romans. They have dominated our way of thinking, and we see everything through their mindsets. This may sound bizarre, but it's through the Greeks and Romans that we understand as much as we do about the past, but they also form a barrier because they themselves did not understand about the times they were living in. And in fact, they were quite capable of getting it wrong because in particular, they did not understand these people, the Egyptians, in spite of living with them for several years, hundreds of years. The Greeks of all the Indo-European tribes were those who were closest to the Egyptians, and it is mostly through the Greeks that we know as much as we do. So you're getting the point that our normal way of thinking about things, shamans, it's all wild and woolly, and that you don't think of pharaohs when we think of shaman, and you don't think of cities when we think of them, and you don't realise that it's because of the Romans and the fact that they form this barrier. But we understand most of what we understand about the ancient past through the Romans and the Greeks because we have inherited their languages, but we've also inherited their mindsets, their way of thinking about things, and that they didn't understand the Egyptians in particular. The Greeks, above all the Indo-European tribes, spent the most time with the Egyptians. They were the closest to them. But at the end of the 4th century AD, even certain possibilities of communicating with the Egyptians disappeared as we lost the ability to understand hieroglyphs. And what we have not appreciated as a result of this break with the ancient past is the influence of the Egyptians and the others in the development of cities. And we've remained largely ignorant of their role and their connections with megaliths and shaman. And in order to understand what that role is, I'm going to take us right back to the beginning, back to the end of the Ice Age. Now this chart, what this chart shows is the dotted line obviously is the extent of the ice. This line down here is the lower sea levels, because obviously when there was lots of ice, that absorbed a lot of water, so the sea level was actually lower. The clans you can read about in my book, I've taken them from Professor Brian Sykes' work on genetics, and these go back thousands, 45,000 years and more. And the story that we tell ourselves is it all starts with a farming experiment, and you can read about that in the British Museum. The Paleolithic man, instead of sitting in his cave, he starts throwing some seeds around. He realizes he has a surplus, and being clever, he decides to exchange it for something else, and suddenly we're on our to becoming civilized and living in towns and cities with them growing out of early marketplaces. And with the help of the Greeks and Romans, we then became extremely civilized. And lots of people continue to believe that. But once you start to challenge the accepted story, something different emerges from the same archaeological record and other possibilities appear. And what I mean is that our misinterpretation of how human progress has come about has in itself obscured a deeper, more important story, one that has not been helped by a misunderstanding of the Egyptians and other ancient cultures. And I think it is only by going back into prehistory, before the Egyptians, that we can get a clearer picture and realise that it is we who are primitive, pagan, well, pagan in the nicest sense, and backwards. In particular, the common view that the path to human progress was all luck, happy chance, does not allow for the possibility that some of our story could be the result of deliberate manipulation by a powerful elite. Çatal Hüyük, who's a well-known writer, though she's now dead, is one of the few to draw attention to this curious situation in her comment that civilization was not inevitable. For on the one hand, men have lived on well-watered and fertile land without creating civilization, and on the other hand, they have created civilizations in apparently poor environments. And she's not alone in her comments. Charles Mazel, he talks about a site here in the upper Zab, which he describes as a zone of rocky limestone hillocks, not really suitable for farming, he says, yet there's plenty of evidence for it here. And it is also in the Golden Crescent that we have the remains of a series of well-built settlements dating to times between the 10th and 8th millennium BC, the most famous being at Çatal Hüyük, which is down here. And I'm not going to talk about Göbekli Tepe here. That's for other people to discuss. It's also a very interesting and ancient site, not far from this area. This is a reconstruction of Çatal Hüyük, and it's something else that's hailed as mankind being on its way to civilized life. And what is significant about Çatal Hüyük is that the central feature of the settlement are well-constructed storerooms, which are better built than the human dwellings around them. This is a plan of the whole thing. It's all very strictly laid out. All the houses are built to the same ground plan. It's something that you would think was the beginning. But it doesn't grow into a city. Nothing else comes out of this. And the diet is resolutely Stone Age. It consists of wild animals, aurochs, and such like. So a contradiction of the idea that markets leads to towns, leads to cities. And here in the Golden Crescent, we have the evidence of the earliest farming, the earliest metalwork, pottery, not civilization as such, but what we might describe as the fingerprints of civilizers. So what were they doing in mountains? I'll come back to this later because it's a very important point. Suddenly, in around the 5000 BC, in what is referred to as early Bronze Age, the first cities start to appear in southern Iraq, which is down here. About as far away from mountains as is possible in this part of the world. One of the oldest of the cities, not on this map, but it's about there. Eridu has a shrine dating to 2000 BC that has 17 layers underneath it that possibly go back as far as 5000 BC. By 3600 BC, Uruk, for example, had become a great city with over 10,000 people. This is what Uruk looks like today, pile of stones. The much later epic of Gilgamesh refers to the quartering of the city with the great temple of Ishtar in one quarter, and we know that these are cities because they have recognizable infrastructure, evidence of activities like administration, record keeping, that kind of thing. Skills that are not innate. We only have to look at our own modern difficulties with teaching well-known civilized skills like writing to know that even after thousands of years these skills have to be taught. But the key thing that happens at about this time is what the archaeologists refer to as the secondary products revolution. I mean, this is an extraordinary coincidence. And what the secondary products revolution in agriculture refers to is a time when all of a sudden we can take milk from a cow and make butter, cheese, the secondary products. We can plough, ride a horse, take wool from a sheep, plant vines, so forth. The kind of farming that we would all recognise, because the earlier farming that happened, apart from the domestication of cereals, was about meat and hides. Our wild animals were penned up for meat and hides, and that was all. You couldn't actually do any of this later stuff. I mean, the most extraordinary thing about the wool from a sheep is you couldn't do this before because a sheep was not sufficiently modified. Sheep had coats like deer. Even though there's evidence going back to 10,500 BC of people eating them, you couldn't actually use their coats. They didn't have wool. And so just how odd and how convenient that just when people start to live in cities, that they go in for all this organised farming. And this shift had to be deliberate because no self-respecting hunter-gatherer would A, give up providing for himself and his family to live in a city until he could be sure that he could rely on someone else, and B, that he had a skill that would be useful in a city. And so there we have modern farming as we would recognise it. And the most notable point about this is that people did not make this transition first from nomadic hunter-gatherer. You'd think that it'd be easy to go to nomadic pastures with sheep and all the rest of it. The shift in Bronze Age farming always involved a settled pattern first, usually identified by the presence of pigs, which cannot be herded long distance. And if you take the example of modern-day Central Asia, Fergana Valley, which is right in the eastern part of Uzbekistan, the Kyrgyz tribes, they herd their massive flocks of sheep over long distances. up into the hills and mountains in the summer and down into the valleys in the winter. And even here, and I have seen it myself in the museum in Tashkent, the capital city of Uzbekistan, even here, the Bronze Age farming pattern is still of the settled pattern first with pigs. The Chust culture shows that. And in particular, farming skills had to be taught. Farming is not natural. If you think it's easy, try it. I haven't. It's not. The hunter-gatherer was not used to staying in one place. He followed the herd. He was more used to killing them than keeping them alive. Farming is a completely different skill set, which involves knowledge of the soil and the calendar. And what this suggests to me is that the early farmers were not necessarily hunter-gatherers who took up farming because of some environmental change or other external pressure, that they were actually a different people with a different knowledge base. Even Julius Caesar knew that aurochs could not be domesticated. In any case, how would Neolithic man, with the benefit of hindsight, know what would make a good cow just from observing it a water hole? How would he have that benefit? And how, in key thing, would he achieve docility? Because I have a farm where I live in East Suffolk, and we have everything on that farm that can kill you, from pigs to bulls to horses, whatever. But the point is something is changed in their heads to make them manageable. And that's one of the things about domestication. There are other things about domestication to do with the change of the shape and all the rest of it. There is a distinct difference between wild and domestic. Now, once you start to question these simple facts that we all take for granted to do with basic food production, it alerts you to other possibilities and questions like how and why. Because I would argue that this change in farming happened because of cities and not the other way around. Not least as the evidence of a city's existence wasn't a marketplace, but a shrine. Çatal Hüyük has also commented on the fact that the key people who are involved in cities from the start are not farmers, they are priests. By this stage in my talk, you might be wondering what this has to do with Megaliths and Shamen, and the connection lies in what these cities represent as a total concept of civilization, a concept in which Megaliths and Shamen were an integral part. They didn't necessarily look like the pictures I showed you at the beginning, but it's still the same thing. Cities did not develop out of farming, but arrived as pre-planned artificial constructs on the landscape. They have identifiable characteristics that link them to a specific archetype, which include the knowledge of how to move the big stones, and has shamanic ritual at the heart of it. Now, I like to call this concept the concept, this archetype. The Egyptians called it living in Ma'at, M-A-T, living in truth, the goddess Ma'at having the feather of truth. But I prefer because which in this context does not mean the famous city that Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s in southern Iraq, which is down here. There's this has been claimed to be the of the Chaldees, and I have good reason to believe that the of the Chaldees is actually up here, either south or north of Haran, but near Haran. And the reason I've chosen this word is because it has the meaning of foundation. And you find it in Jerusalem, Urushalem, which means foundation of peace. And the best way I think to describe this archetype is with the help of a colour wheel. It's based on all the usual attributes of ascribed to city living: straightness, accuracy, precision, design, organisation. Animals were domesticated variants. Government involved bureaucracy. Trade was based on exchange of contract and contract law. Cooking was cuisine, spices, not things gathered from the hedges, but things brought in from a distance to make cuisine. And on an organised scale, bakeries, breweries, and fields were irrigated and drained. And if any part of the circle is more important than any other, it's the temple at the centre, which holds all the parts in balance. It was the priesthood who supervised the foundation of cities, the construction of the great engineering works, the monumental architecture. They sanctioned the trading exchanges, they determined the calendar, educated the young, kept written records, healed the sick, helped the dying on their way. They understood the importance of the soul, the psyche, and its role in reincarnation and immortality. And were they perhaps the ones who were involved in the domestic genetic modification of animals? There are also interesting relationships across the circle to do with cooked food and how medicine helps people bring themselves into balance, the whole communication thing, trade and that kind of stuff. This is obviously agriculture, these two connect. And this is the one that's really interesting, which is the power one, the Melchizedek, the king-priest relationship. Melchizedek in itself has the meaning of Melch to do with king and Zedek to do with priest. And this is relating to the shamanic part, which I will come to in a minute. And this is an archetype which exists for all time and in all places, and the same characteristics appear in the Near East as in the Indus Valley, in Phoenicia, Minoan Crete, as well as Egypt, Central and Southern America, and possibly the Far East, China, but I haven't gone into that. Egypt became the best example, but it wasn't the only one. But for me, what is truly extraordinary, and this is the surprising bit of evidence, is the evidence from a certain source which you'll not be aware of necessarily, in which, in my view, confirm these certain aspects of it. And this contact between an uncivilized people who hold this evidence must have taken place over 5,000 years ago, between the civilized people who built the cities and a group of people who were very uncivilized, people who themselves did not come to live in cities for another 2,500 years. And they also lived a long way away from the civilized. They were not on the doorstep. And yet there is close contact, evidence of close contact between them and the city builders. And this evidence can be found in the analysis of the earliest roots of their language. The people that I'm talking about are quite probably many of our European ancestors, even though they didn't live in Europe at this time. These are the very early Indo-European tribes, long before they came to Europe, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And the linguistic evidence suggests that they came into contact with each other before the end of the 4th millennium BC. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware there's this idea that certain tribes, Celts, Romans, Greeks, whatever, you can look at this list of languages, once lived together. Otherwise, one has a Monty Python-esque view of ancient Celts travelling thousands of miles to let the Indians know that the word for X is now Y. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, the thing is that for this to have worked, they must have been in close proximity. And what the linguists have worked out, I mean, this isn't my research, this is my research based on what perfectly established mainstream people have written about, is it was more than 3,000 years ago. And how this was discovered was in the 19th century when they realised that Indian Sanskrit, although written in a different alphabet, has the same language roots as other European languages. And it doesn't include Hungarian or Basque, who had different languages. Hungarian, although quite close physically to these early Europeans, came from a different linguistic and tribal background, as indeed did the Basque. So they remain as little islands, linguistic islands, which prove this kind of hypothesis to some extent. And etymology, the study of language, reveals what kind of environment we knew, what kind of dwellings we had, what skills we had, and to a certain extent what we thought. And in my opinion, certain key concepts relating to the civilization archetype have been embedded in our language for more than 5,000 years. And we were still living in mud huts at this time. We did not benefit wholesale from the introduction of the concept. Now, the location of their homeland is controversial. I personally think that it's up here in the Pontic Caspian. And there are lots, I won't go into all the reasons why I think that, but it's a long way, as you can see, from Mesopotamia. This is where the civilizers were. But there's a very good reason why these people would want to make contact with these people. There's a certain something that the Proto-Indo-Europeans had, which the civilized were prepared to exchange ideas and skills for. And this certain something was the wild horse, the tarpan. The Indo-Europeans lived in the range of the tarpan. And until the arrival of the civilizers, it had been of little use to them. Meat and hides, and that was all. They didn't ride them at this point. The first domesticated horse bones are usually reckoned to be here at Stredny Stog in the Ukraine. They date to 4000 BC. And the breakthrough in the exploitation of the deep steppe using horses did not happen to about 3500 BC. This is the range of the wild horse. And the first carts didn't appear on north of the Black Sea until about 3000 BC. But the civilized would have brought the horses down from the Ukraine, and within a certain period of time, there is evidence of their use in Mesopotamia. It was longer before the impact was obvious, but by 2800 BC, 80% of Sumerians living down here, I don't know if all of you can see this map, but anyway, but believe me, it's right down here. 80% of them lived in cities with wheeled carts and so forth. Now, the shift from wild to domestic horses had such an impact on the Proto-Europeans that they continued to venerate them for thousands of years. They attributed godlike powers to them. And their attitude to religion was very simple. It was very nature-based, sky god, earth mother. The word for religion can be reconstructed in the word creed, through the word creed, which is two words in Proto-Indo-European. It's kr and d, which mean put into your heart, which is a lovely thought. So we have evidence of contact. The other evidence is suggested in the idea that the Indo-Europeans knew about words like bronze. They knew about bronze, and they knew about copper, but they had no word for tin, which suggests that they got their bronze from somewhere, but they didn't actually necessarily know how to make it. And we also picked up from the civilizers over 5,000 years practical farming skills. They benefited from the secondary products revolution. So we got to know about stock breeding. Sheep, cattle can be reconstructed to Indo-European, as can secondary products like butter and cheese. But the one concept that has fooled the linguists and has made them think this is really odd is a word relating to the concept of king, reg. This is a reconstructed word. A word in Proto-Indo-European has an asterisk at the front, which is why you know it's a reconstructed word. And as you can see, this word, it comes out in rex, raj, reich, recht, and it can be reconstructed the earliest level of Proto-Indo-European language, and it's remarkable because for me, it relates to the rules, regulation, accuracy aspect of the archetype. Now, what the linguists have said is there must have been two kings, one that did ruling and one that did warfare, because all we did was live in wild, in mud huts where the hearth was the focus. I mean, that was all we knew. We did not build cities at this point. So we picked up a word that we didn't understand the full meaning of. Now, one of my closest friends is a very clever Cambridge don who specialises in linguistics and mathematics and computers and all sorts. And he says this isn't possible. He says it's not possible to have a hidden meaning. And I just don't believe him. I think it is possible because I think the Indo-Europeans didn't understand what king fully meant because they never picked up the knowledge of the shamanic role of the king. And then what happened at the end of the 4th millennium BC, there was a huge global catastrophe which resulted in a massive migration of everybody, Proto-Indo-European, city builders, everything. And it's after this date that Egypt, as we know it, dynastic Egypt, appears. And people went in search of safer, newer homelands. Nobody quite knows what it was. It could have been a comet, it could have been anything. But it basically created a kind of earth wobble and made people very nervous. And it's at this point that the Indo-Europeans split up into their individual tribes, and the city builders had no further common impact on them. So whatever knowledge they had got stuck. So these are linguistically frozen in time, which is why I think it's so interesting to use language as a way of looking at it. This map shows you roughly what directions everybody went in. The Celts went the furthest. They went the furthest west, ending up in Ireland. They also went to the east, and ending up in China. And some of you may already know this, but don't laugh. 4,000-year-old, 6-foot-tall gingerhead mummies wearing tartan have been found in the Taklamakan Desert. And this is true. I'm not making it up. The Celts were possibly the most interesting because they retained the most links, the most archaism, and they claim links with the Indians and Scythians. So the Celts are the one to watch. And to give one example, the Egyptian god Thoth, here on the left, the god of writing, he goes by many names. He goes by names like Tuat, Tut, Tut, the Thoth, all sorts of names. The Romans and the Greeks had already changed him to Hermes and Mercury, and yet the Celts possibly retained a more ancient knowledge of the gods of the civilized. And at the same time that Romans and Greeks had changed him, the Celts were calling him Tetates. I mean, those of you who can't see it, it's written down here. Now, is the implication of this Celtic reference that Egyptian deities could have been known to the Proto-Indo-Europeans before the start of Egypt? I don't know. The name Hermes in itself is worth commenting on because it could possibly be an adaptation of Ur-Mes, that word Ur again, Mes meaning son of. So it could be that the Greeks saw Thoth as the son of the foundation. I just leave that thought with you. But in spite of the close proximity of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and civilizers, there's no obvious evidence that they knew about shamanism in order to access the metaphysical secrets of the original archetype, that priest-king thing, which is perhaps why they never built cities themselves. And I should explain now, I mean, I know Peter did talk about Shaman earlier, And I don't want to add too much to what he said, but I would just say that it is someone who has an out-of-body experience. They go on a journey as a spirit on behalf of a person or a community in order to get answers. And the important point to understand is that the information thus obtained is not discoverable through experimentation, as it often involves the use of poisons that would otherwise be fatal if you didn't know exactly what you're doing. You don't get a chance to experiment with it. And that is a really, really key part to understand about that. And how this applies to the original archetype of civilization is it was the role of the king to undertake a special journey on behalf of his people. And in the case of Egypt, that person was the pharaoh, a title, interestingly enough, which could be a Greek corruption of the words per-ur, and per-ur means house of foundation. Ur again, this word ur. And what that relates to is the physical location where the pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, was taken for his initiation, which could have been here at a place called Nekhen, or Heracleopolis, which is a mysterious fort with no defensive purposes. Now, what the pharaoh prepared for here was a highly important festival which only happened every 40 years, and is also referred to as the pharaoh's jubilee, which the Egyptians called the Heb-Sed festival. And it incorporated the Osirian rites, a reenactment of the death of Osiris and his revival at the hands of Isis, his wife. This is a picture of Saqqara, one place where the Heb-Sed festival happened. And down here we have the special Heb-Sed festival court, because it always involved the special construction of a pyramid. And there were public aspects and secret aspects. Citizens came from all over Egypt to the festival, and the purpose of it was to rededicate the country to civilization. And in the public aspects, the pharaoh wore a special kilt, and he ran around his courtyard wearing this kilt. And then he participated in a ritual meal called the hetep, which I'll come back to. After this meal, he disappeared into the secret part of the festival, which took place inside the pyramid, where he entered the realm of the deity Sokar. This is Sokar down the bottom. And Sokar is interesting because of what he represents. He had a more complicated association with death than just being dead. He was part of a triple manifestation of the gods Ptah, Sokar, and Osiris. And these gods represented the triple powers of animation, incarnation, and restoration, and were essential to the Egyptian ideas of the cycles of life and death, in terms of the soul being immortal and reincarnated in a living body. Writer Rosemary Clark describes Sokar as representing the latent spiritual principle within all living things, the spirit embedded in the deepest regions of matter that await arousal, a description which implies the beginning of life rather than the end of it. Now, it is our cultural problem that we think of pyramids as tombs, and very few dead bodies have been found in them. The Egyptians mostly buried their dead in places like West Bank of the Nile or mud brick mastabas. And the other clue to the purpose of a pyramid is the word mr, M-R, which is the Egyptian word for them, which means instrument for ascending. And another way is to look at their construction. I've just put up this picture of the Great Pyramid, but it's no different from any others. It's perhaps just bigger and more impressive and more interesting to us. What is remarkable about this pyramid, it's very carefully constructed and very deliberately constructed, and there's no kind of any internal decoration, whereas the mastabas all had decorated scenes of life for the pharaoh in his afterlife. And what is most important about the king is the king's chamber, this one that you're all familiar with. And this is where the megaliths come in, because these are enormous, extraordinary granite slabs weighing up to 50 tons, brought 500 miles from the quarry in Aswan. Now, just because they don't have the shape of megaliths in the UK doesn't mean to say they're not megaliths. After all, megalith just means big stone. And these slabs were used in this chamber in such a way that their function was not visual. It's been deliberately constructed so that the walls are actually not tied into the ceiling. The ceiling is supported by walls beyond the walls. And there are these series of, you can't see it very well in this picture, but series of slabs above which are hidden, and these have chunks taken out of them. And a plausible explanation is it was for the purpose of creating an electrical field using vibration. Quartz and the granite has piezoelectrical properties, and so the whole thing can vibrate. Now, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the work of Chris Dunn, and I don't wish to disagree with anything that he says. Giza is a power plant. I don't think he's wrong, but I just think that he perhaps slightly overlooks the ritual functions of the pyramid. And I don't think they were generating power because, after all, they didn't have toasters and hairdryers like we do, so they didn't have a need for lots of electricity. But I do think that they used electricity for the purposes of ritual. Now, and this is also another way of reinforcing this idea of vibration. This is a picture of the pharaoh's Hebsed festival bed, and you can see Tutankhamun's golden bed in the Cairo Museum. Gold is a good conductor of electricity. And then before he went into the chamber, he put on the Keni garment over his chest. And he participated in the Wapawet, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Now, in using the Keni garment and doing this, was he using the Keni garment to protect his heart from an electrical field? And was the opening of the mouth ceremony to stop him from swallowing his tongue during a trance? And what confirms my suspicion that this was all part of a shamanic ritual are the pyramid or coffin texts discovered by Flinders Petrie in the 19th century. It's our cultural problem, again, that we think of them as a description of the pharaoh's journey of his soul after death, whereas it's much more likely they describe his soul's journey in life. And Dr. Jeremy Nadler, an Oxford academic, is one of the few who has come to this conclusion. The pyramid texts frequently refer to the pharaoh taking the form of a bird, flying up, climbing a ladder. Chapter 20 of the Book of the Dead, for example, talks of the pharaoh rising to the sky like a mighty hawk. The antechamber texts in the pyramid of Unas in Saqqara refer to a stairway to the sky, which is set up for me that I may ascend to it on the sky. I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. And elsewhere, other texts refer to the pharaoh flying up in the form of a falcon, to the imperishable northern stars, an important point which I'll come back to. And this is all shamanic language. That's the really key part about it. And if this was a shamanic experience, was the hetep meal the means by which the pharaoh brought on the trance? And a significant element of the meal was the solar bread. And there are references to solar bread in the pyramid texts. One of them, for example, refers to it as an enigmatic food spell and uttering for the offering bread to fly up. So what was this solar bread? This is an essential ingredient of the hetep meal. It clearly has special properties. And this is when the story gets really interesting, because it's at this point that the Greeks, through whom we know as much as we do, got confused. And what I think they confused was a process with an outcome. And as a result, we know about the process, but we're not aware of the outcome and what its purpose is. And that process was what we call alchemy. Now, have we been misled by alchemy? The usual source of the word Ken doesn't fit in this context. I think alchemy is this word, the fixed northern stars, the Kemi. This is the Egyptian word for these fixed northern stars. So in my view, what the pharaoh was doing was astral planing to these. And it doesn't mean just the Black Land. It actually means where he was taking himself to, but the Greeks didn't understand it. Now, the thing about alchemy is we've always think of it as changing metal into gold, blah, blah, and spiritual transformation. But I think it's more likely to be purification of gold to achieve an even purer gold. This picture I put up is a picture of the 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian golden ram caught in the thicket, which you can see in the British Museum. It's an example of very pure gold. And there are several methods for achieving purification, and one of them is to expose gold to a high electrical charge to remove impurities, and to turn it into a pure white powder, the monatomic gold. And the Egyptians possibly used the levitational properties of this white powder in the form of the solar bread as a means of taking themselves on the shamanic journey. And the thing that I think links it all is the cow goddess Hathor, who is very involved in the whole process because she has a role as a nurturer. She often lent her horns to Isis. You can see, we can't really see Isis because the picture is so dark, but there's a picture of Isis here on the right, who's nurturing the infant Horus. But it's Hathor who nurtures the soul of the pharaoh on his journey. And what makes this really interesting is these locations of two key temples. One is this one at Serabit El Khadim in the Sinai Peninsula, where our hero of the moment, Hugh Newman, has been, and perhaps you'd like to tell us about it one day, because I think it's a deeply interesting place. And what was found here in the 19th century was a mysterious white powder, vast quantities hidden under slabs in the floor. And furthermore, another of her names is Nub-t, and Nub-t is the Egyptian word for gold. And if you go to her temple at Dendra on the Nile, you can see the hieroglyph for gold on the back wall of the temple. And it's at Dendra that you find these strange things. And this is a drawing that my father did for me of a little bit of the crypt release. And I'm not going to go into the electrical processes here, but I'm just putting these ideas all together for you to work it out. In the 1950s, Muni Sadhu wrote a fundamental work on the tarot. We're talking about alchemy, and he alludes to the role of electricity in his summary of a typical process. He explains in detail the stages that an alchemist might follow to achieve the philosopher's stone, which he describes as a powder. The first phase is the preparation of the universal solvent, or using a mineral called magnesia of the sages. The second phase is the operation, which produces a dazzling white colour after the slow heating in the athanol, his alchemist's oven. And there are several points to note. One, that the stone is a powder. Two, that the description is of it as electrical charge. And the third thing is that it produces a dazzling white colour, white powder. Now, is this the powder that Flinders Petrie discovered in the Hathor temple? Who knows? And what writer Lawrence Gardner does is he describes in detail the whole molecular structure thing to do with monatomic gold. So now we have lots of ingredients of the pharaoh having this meal and where he did and the process. But is there a link here between an Egyptian word for gods or fundamental natures, and who was it that the pharaoh was communicating with? Was he communicating with these particular fundamental natures? Because the thing that is really extraordinary, and another connection back to the Indo-Europeans, and this is the word nita, which in Egyptian is a word that lots of you are probably familiar with because it means gods and so forth. Now, is it just a coincidence that this word in Proto-Indo-European means snake? And you can't see at the bottom here, but I've written down the Latin natrix, Old Irish nather, and in English, neder becomes adder. You take away the N. And the thing that's really interesting here is research by Jeremy Narby in his book, The Cosmic Serpent. And he travelled to Peru in 1985 as part of his PhD from Stanford University in anthropology, and he was in the Amazon, and he undertook shamanic experiences while he was there using the ayahuasca vine. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with Graham Hancock's work on this subject too, but I'm just going to focus on Narby for the moment. And what Narby discovered was how native people acquired their knowledge of medicinal plants and knew precisely which to choose out of 80,000 Amazonian plant species. And these plants are often highly toxic and require special preparation before use. Otherwise, they would kill you. You don't have a chance to experiment with them. And he was told that how they found out this information was through shamanism, and he personally experienced it as well. And what particularly struck Narby during his shamanic experience was the appearance of a pair of enormous snakes who communicated with him. And this visual parallel between the images of the snake and what we know are more familiar with the caduceus associated with Thoth, associated with Hermes. And what Narby came to conclusion was that the parallel was more than visual, it was actual. Narby concluded that Shamen were communicating at the level of molecular biology of DNA itself. He was surprised to find in the technical literature that the shape of double helix of DNA, which you can see here, is most often described as a ladder or spiral staircase, which compares with that shamanic language. Frequent references made to climbing a ladder during a trance. Now, what the pharaohs of ancient Egypt were doing was a more sophisticated version of the Peruvian jungle one. And knowing the importance of gold to the whole process also explains why gold appears to start in mountains, because that is where the gold is. And the point about Çatal Hüyük and why the storerooms were better constructed than the human dwellings was because Çatal Hüyük was part of the supply chain of emporia. There were several of these going through in this area, which were built to support operations elsewhere in mountains. I mean, none of this rubbish about people need to be in mountains for defensive reasons or anything like that. These elites who were carrying out these operations or using the locals, using the indigenous people to carry out operations, cared more about being able to support them. Mesopotamia itself down here had no gold reserves, and yet its ancient name of Ki-ng, which you can't see very well here, translates as land where gold is king. Mesopotamian gold obviously came from the aptly named Golden Crescent, and what made the hair stand on the back of my neck was when I realised that the sites where the earliest pottery was found in the Golden Crescent, here at Hamadan, are near gold mines and important routes for gold. And all throughout here, there is stuff, there are toponyms, there are place names which refer to gold. I won't go into detail now, but I do write about David Roll's idea of the Garden of Eden being up here west of Tabriz. And here, the only reason I look at this is because it talks about gold. And the Genesis talks about gold of the land of Havilah, where gold was very good. And there are lots of place names up in that area where there are also referenced river names and so forth, gold. It should now be clear that the links between megaliths, the ability to move massive stones weighing 50 tons or more over vast distances, and Shamen, wise men, kings, pharaohs who can take their souls on the journeys for benefit of others at great personal risk themselves, and the concept of city building are all integral to each other. But the reason why we don't realise any of this is because of that barrier, the barrier that the Greeks and Romans have created for us. A barrier that grew even greater after the Romans came under the influence of a monotheistic religion that we call Christianity from the 4th century AD onwards. I would personally argue that it was at this point that civilization collapsed and that we have been living in the Dark Ages ever since, struggling to reconnect with the original archetype that appeared in the Bronze Age over 5,000 years ago. This place on the Nile is where, in the 4th century AD, fanatical Romano-Christians massacred the last Egyptian priests. This is the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, right in the Upper Nile. And those fanatical Romano-Christians were the same people who destroyed the Eleusinian Mysteries sites in Greece, near Athens, in 396 AD. They burnt down the famous library at Alexandria in 415, brutally murdering Hypatia, its priestess. And we might mistakenly think that the massacre that happened here occurred because the Christianized Romans had seen the light and realized the need to eliminate pagan practices. The truth is, however, is that the Romans had been attacking certain sorts of pagans for hundreds of years before they converted to Christianity. The pagans that the Romans waged military campaigns against all had something in common. These people all knew something about ancient civilization. And this is a list of some of the things that they did. Romans threw out Pythagoreans from Rome. They banned alchemy. They invaded Britain, I think, and so do others, in order to deliberately destroy the Druids, because Mona was the first place on Anglesey where they took one of their campaigns to. They fought campaigns particularly in central Turkey in order to destroy the Chaldean Magi. This is all around AD 70 and earlier. And they attacked the Essenes at Qumran on the Dead Sea. And all this happened long before, several hundreds of years before the Christians infiltrated the Roman state. Indeed, Constantine's decision to adopt Christianity in the 4th century was because he could see the political advantages of it, and his wife and his mother were very keen, and I go into all of this in my book. The Romans were used to uniting behind the glory of Rome, and they could now use religion and one God as another tool of unification. And this monotheistic religion then became a useful weapon for attacking those pagan pockets that had metaphysical secrets denied to the Romans. Long before that, however, life had become difficult for Egypt. Indeed, the change from Bronze Age to Iron Age, characterised by the fall of Troy, marks the start of Egypt's long decline. This list here just shows you the gradual stages. In possibly 1159 BC, an Icelandic volcano, there are always trouble, these Icelandic volcanoes, erupted, causing 20 years of poor harvests, famine and appalling social destruction, including a horrible form of child sacrifice. And it's said then that the Hittites had accidentally revealed the secret of using iron. So this time when catastrophe struck, the barbarians who went in search of food and went on the rampage were better armed. Egypt had become increasingly vulnerable to invasion, which happened first with the Persians in around 600 BC, and then Alexander the Great, although he was a bit different because he actually loved Egypt, so he wanted to be there because he loved it, so he's a little unusual as an invader. And the Egyptians had already started opening themselves up to the Greeks around 500 BC, which explains why, all of a sudden, the Greeks knew everything. You know, we always say, oh, it starts with the Greeks. Well, no wonder, because they learned it all from the Egyptians. So from around 500 BC onwards, they suddenly knew all about mathematics, geometry, geography, medicine, all the rest of it. I mean, Pythagoras is reckoned to have spent 25 years in Egyptian temples. And the Romans, who were so desperate to get hold of Egypt, didn't really succeed until Antony and Cleopatra. Within a few hundred years following that, the Romano Christians had symbolically and literally cut off from the ancient past, with the deaths of those last Egyptian priests. The ability to read hieroglyphs was then lost and only rediscovered 1,500 years later in the 19th century with Champollion. As a result, one means, albeit limited, of accessing Egyptian wisdom disappeared and soon forgotten. But it should be said that at the same time, the Egyptians were keen that their secrets should not fall into the hands of the Romans. So it's probably just as well in many ways. Because the Romans were quite powerful enough without ever discovering the secret technique for moving big stones. I mean, it's not to say that they didn't, but they didn't move them that often. They couldn't move them that easily. And if anyone still falls for the explanation that megaliths are moved by teams of slaves, then bear this point in mind. The Rome was the ultimate enslaved society, and they still couldn't move megaliths that easily. The Romans had to invent the pulley and the mortar. And the reason I put this photo up is because what the Romans tended to use was either smaller dressed stones or many, many bricks. And if you go to Rome, the Forum Romano, this is one of the most impressive buildings, and it's all built with tiny, weeny little bricks. So if it really was that easy to move megaliths and use them for building, why didn't the Romans do it? The Egyptians had realised long before that the writing, as it were, was on the wall, and the end lay ahead. There's a particularly sad prophecy in the Hermetica, which goes, "If the truth were told, our land is the temple of the whole world. A time will come when Egypt will be abandoned. The land that was the seat of reverence will be widowed by the powers and left destitute of their presence. When foreigners occupy the land and territory, not only will reverence fall into neglect, but a prohibition will be enacted against reverence, fidelity, and divine worship. Then this most holy land, seat of shrines and temples, will be completely filled with tombs and corpses. Only stories will survive, and they will be incredible to your children. Only words cut in stone will survive to tell your faithful works. Whoever survives will be recognized as an Egyptian only by his language. In his actions, he will seem a foreigner." And so it was that the connections between megaliths, shamans, and cities were hidden for a long time, and I think needed to be, because that knowledge was for peaceful purposes only. Alchemy remained the missing link. The secret techniques of how to access the knowledge did not entirely die out after Egypt collapsed, but I think went up the trade routes to the northern Euphrates, to Haran, where it's kept alive by alchemists and people known as the Sabians. And I do, in my book, go into some detail about how it came back through the Knights Templars, through the Renaissance. But the story of how we began to reconnect with that hidden knowledge, I will leave to another time. And you can read about it in my book, which I will be signing copies for if you want downstairs. And thank you all very much for listening.